The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his goggles and checked his dive bomber's instruments one final time. It was June 4th, 1942, and somewhere, beyond the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled was bearing down on Midway Atoll. What McCluskey didn't know was that in the next few hours, he would help deliver one of the most decisive blows in naval warfare history. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had conceived an audacious plan to eliminate the remaining American carrier force and establish Japanese dominance in the Pacific once and for all. Operation MI, as it was codenamed, would involve the largest naval armada Japan had ever deployed: 4 heavy aircraft carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers, all converging on the tiny coral atoll of Midway. But unknown to Yamamoto, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had achieved the impossible. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, these unsung heroes had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz knew not only the target but also the exact composition of the Japanese fleet and their planned routes of approach. According to declassified documents from the National Security Agency, the code-breaking effort at Pearl Harbor represented one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II, directly influencing the strategic decisions that would shape the battle. Admiral Nimitz faced a critical decision. With only 3 operational aircraft carriers against Yamamoto's 6, the odds seemed insurmountable. The USS Yorktown, severely damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier, was rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor in a miraculous 72-hour effort that should have taken 3 months. Welders were still aboard when she sailed, continuing repairs even as the ship headed toward its destiny. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for what seemed like certain annihilation. Colonel Harold Shannon commanded fewer than 3,000 Marines and Navy personnel, supported by a motley collection of aircraft that included obsolete Buffalo fighters and antiquated Vindicator dive bombers. The defenders knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also understood the strategic importance of their position. Midway served as America's westernmost outpost, a crucial stepping stone that, if captured, would give Japan the ability to threaten Hawaii itself. As the Japanese fleet approached under cover of darkness, radio operators across the Pacific monitored frequencies with growing tension. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Japan's vision of Pacific dominance would become reality or whether the United States could halt the seemingly inexorable advance of the rising sun. In the pre-dawn hours of June 4th, as sailors on both sides made final preparations, few could have imagined that the next 4 days would witness one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared off the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. 108 bombers and fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, streaked toward Midway Atoll through the gray dawn sky. Their mission was clear: neutralize the American air defenses and soften the island's fortifications for the anticipated amphibious assault. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming formation while it was still over 100 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. 26 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, piloted by young Marines who had never seen combat, climbed desperately toward the approaching enemy formation. They were joined by 6 Navy Wildcats, all that remained of Midway's modern fighter defense. The aerial battle that followed was a massacre. The Japanese Zero fighters, among the most advanced aircraft in the world, tore through the American defenders with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Buffaloes had been shot down, their pilots either dead or struggling to survive in the shark-infested waters below. Marine Captain John Carey, one of the few survivors, would later describe the encounter as like sparrows attacking eagles. Despite the heroic sacrifice of the American fighters, the Japanese bombers reached their target. For 20 minutes, Midway endured a hellish bombardment as bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel storage facilities, and defensive positions. Hangars erupted in flames, sending pillars of black smoke high into the tropical sky. Yet even as buildings collapsed and equipment was destroyed, the island's crucial infrastructure remained largely intact. The runways, though damaged, were still operational. Lieutenant Tominaga, circling overhead to assess the damage, made a fateful decision. Keying his radio, he transmitted a message that would alter the course of the battle. There is need for a second attack. This recommendation would force Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, into a series of critical decisions that would ultimately seal Japan's fate. Historians from the Naval War College have noted that Tominaga's call for a second strike created a tactical dilemma that exemplified the fog of war, forcing commanders to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Meanwhile, American bombers from Midway were already airborne, searching for the Japanese fleet. 16 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, led by Major Lofton Henderson, had taken off before dawn with orders to locate and attack the enemy carriers. These pilots, most flying combat missions for the first time, knew they faced overwhelming odds. Their aircraft, while sturdy, were no match for the Zero fighters protecting the Japanese fleet. At 7:10 in the morning, Henderson spotted the enemy carriers through a break in the clouds. The sight that greeted him was both magnificent and terrifying. 6 aircraft carriers surrounded by a protective screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all arranged in perfect formation on the azure Pacific. Without hesitation, Henderson led his squadron into their attack dive, even as Zero fighters swarmed up to meet them. The American attack was brave, but ultimately futile. Henderson's aircraft was hit almost immediately, bursting into flames as it plunged toward the sea. One by one, the other dive bombers fell to the deadly accurate fire of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Of the 16 aircraft that had taken off from Midway, only 3 would return, and those were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain, for their attack had forced Admiral Nagumo to make a decision that would prove catastrophic. He ordered his second wave of aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs for attacks on American ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike on Midway aboard the flagship Akagi. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced the most complex tactical situation of his distinguished career. At 7:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, his staff officers presented him with conflicting intelligence that would force a decision destined to echo through history. The morning's successful attack on Midway had been costly, and Lieutenant Tominaga's request for a second strike seemed tactically sound. Yet disturbing reports were filtering in from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, suggesting the presence of American naval forces in the area. The situation became critical when, at 7:28, a float plane from the cruiser Tone radioed, a terse message that sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo's blood ran cold. If American carriers were in the area, his entire fleet could be in mortal danger. What followed was perhaps the most crucial hour in Pacific naval warfare. Nagumo's aircraft were in the midst of being rearmed for the second Midway strike when the sighting report arrived. Changing the armament again would require precious time during which his fleet would remain vulnerable to American attack. Yet leaving his aircraft armed with land attack weapons would render them useless against enemy ships. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Nagumo ordered the rearming to continue, gambling that he could complete the process before any American attack materialized. Military analysts from the United States Naval Institute have described Nagumo's dilemma as one of the classic examples of tactical decision-making under extreme pressure, where perfect information was unavailable and time was the enemy's greatest ally. Unknown to Nagumo, at that very moment, American dive bombers were already airborne and searching for his fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the USS Enterprise, had made his own calculated gamble. Despite being still over 200 miles from the enemy, he had launched his entire attack force at 7 in the morning, betting everything on catching the Japanese carriers while their aircraft were refueling and rearming. The American strike force was formidable, but untested under such extreme conditions. 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, formed the spearhead of the attack. They were joined by 17 dauntless bombers from the USS Hornet under Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson, and 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. As the American aircraft droned westward through the morning sky, they faced their own navigational challenges. The Japanese fleet had changed course since the last sighting report, and fuel was becoming a critical concern for aircraft operating at the extreme edge of their range. Several squadrons became separated in the vast expanse of the Pacific, their radio communications hampered by distance and atmospheric interference. Lieutenant Commander Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8, made a fateful decision to trust his instincts rather than follow the prescribed search pattern. Banking left from the main formation, he led his 15 torpedo bombers directly toward where he believed the Japanese fleet would be. His intuition proved correct, but at a terrible cost. At 9:20 in the morning, Waldron's squadron found the enemy carriers, but they attacked alone, without fighter escort or coordinated support from the dive bombers. The result was a slaughter that would become legend in naval aviation circles. Japanese Zero fighters fell upon the slow, low-flying torpedo bombers like wolves among sheep. One by one, the American aircraft were shot down, their crews dying in the cold Pacific waters. Within 10 minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft had been destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a life raft and watching in horror as the battle continued to unfold around him. Yet Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice served a crucial purpose. Their attack had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the enemy carriers momentarily vulnerable to attack from above. At exactly 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through the plexiglass canopy of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber and witnessed a sight that would be burned into his memory forever. After nearly 3 hours of searching the empty Pacific, his fuel gauge dangerously low, McCluskey had made the decision to follow the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at full speed. His gamble had paid off spectacularly. Spread out below him in perfect formation were the 4 aircraft carriers of Admiral Nagumo's striking force: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline lines snaked across. The wooden decks and ordnance was stacked in neat piles awaiting loading. McCluskey had found the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment, and he had barely enough fuel for one attack before being forced to turn back toward his own carriers. The scene that unfolded in the next 6 minutes would transform the Pacific War. McCluskey divided his 37 dive bombers into 2 groups, leading 19 aircraft against the Kaga, while his 2nd Division, commanded by Lieutenant Richard Best, targeted the Akagi. At the same moment, as if choreographed by divine intervention, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived with 17 dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, targeting the Soryu. According to the official action reports archived at the Naval Historical Center, the convergence of 3 separate American dive bomber squadrons on the Japanese carriers represented one of the most remarkable coincidences in naval warfare, occurring without any coordination between the attacking units. The Japanese were caught, completely off guard. Their combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo bomber attacks, was still climbing back to altitude when the American dive bombers appeared overhead like avenging angels. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships created a deadly web of exploding shells, but the American pilots pressed their attacks with grim determination. Lieutenant Commander Best, leading the attack on the Akagi, pushed his dive bomber into a 70-degree dive, the airframe shuddering under the tremendous G-forces as he plummeted toward the enemy flagship. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive so violently that he temporarily lost consciousness. Behind him, his bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck near the midships elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck below, where it detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion was catastrophic. Secondary detonations ripped through the carrier as aviation gasoline ignited and stored ammunition began to cook off. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a blazing inferno. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara as his flagship burned uncontrollably around him. The attack on the Kaga was equally devastating. McCluskey's dive bombers scored multiple hits on the carrier's flight deck and island structure. The massive ship, veteran of Pearl Harbor and countless other battles, began listing heavily to port as fires raged throughout her hull. Captain Jisaku Okada, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered the evacuation of all non-essential personnel, while damage control parties fought desperately to save their vessel. Meanwhile, the Soryu suffered perhaps the most concentrated attack of all. Lieutenant Commander Leslie's bombers from the Yorktown achieved what naval aviators would later describe as textbook accuracy, scoring 3 direct hits in rapid succession. The carrier's wooden flight deck collapsed into the hangar bay below, trapping hundreds of sailors in a maze of twisted metal and roaring flames. In just 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 most experienced aircraft carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. Hundreds of veteran pilots, irreplaceable assets who had trained for years before the war, perished in the flames or drowned in the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. The tactical balance in the Pacific had shifted dramatically, but the battle was far from over. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained undamaged and dangerous, her aircraft already being prepared for a counterstrike that would test American resolve to its limits. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, watching, in stunned disbelief, as 3 of his companion carriers burned like funeral pyres on the morning horizon. It was 11:30 on June 4th, 1942, and the unthinkable had happened. The most powerful naval striking force in Japanese history had been crippled in a matter of minutes by American dive bombers. Yet Kaku was not a man to surrender to despair. The Hiryu remained undamaged, and her aircraft were fueled and ready for action. Within 30 minutes of the devastating American attack, 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters roared off the Hiryu's flight deck under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American carrier force, and their mission was nothing less than vengeance for the morning's catastrophe. Japanese scout planes had located the USS Yorktown, and Kobayashi's pilots were determined to even the score. The Yorktown, commanded by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had been operating at the center of Task Force 17 since dawn. Her crew had already launched their morning strike against the Japanese carriers, and now they prepared to receive the inevitable counterstrike. At radar stations throughout the task force, operators watched as the Japanese formation appeared on their screens, approaching from the northwest at high speed. At 11:55, the Yorktown's combat air patrol engaged the incoming Japanese bombers 40 miles from the task force. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, leading a squadron of Wildcat fighters, employed innovative tactics that would later bear his name. The Thatch Weave allowed his outnumbered fighters to cover each other's blind spots. But even with this tactical advantage, several Japanese bombers broke through the defensive screen. Naval aviation historians have noted that the Japanese counterstrike on the Yorktown demonstrated the resilience and professionalism of both sides' naval aviators, even under the most desperate circumstances. The attack on the Yorktown began at 12:10 in the afternoon with a precision that reflected years of training and combat experience. Despite intensive anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts, Lieutenant Kobayashi's dive bombers pressed their attack with the same determination their American counterparts had shown earlier that morning. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown, in rapid succession, penetrating her flight deck and exploding deep within the ship's hull. The first bomb struck near the island structure, starting fires that quickly spread through the carrier's superstructure. The second bomb penetrated the flight deck amidships, destroying several aircraft and killing dozens of sailors in the hangar bay below. The third and most damaging hit occurred near the ship's uptakes, disrupting the boiler room ventilation system and gradually reducing the Yorktown's speed as her engineering crew struggled to maintain steam pressure. Captain Buckmaster, his ship damaged but still fighting, ordered immediate damage control efforts while simultaneously preparing to receive what intelligence indicated would be a second wave of Japanese attackers. The Yorktown's crew, many of whom were veterans of the Coral Sea battle just a month earlier, worked with practiced efficiency to extinguish fires, shore up damaged bulkheads, and restore the ship's fighting capability. Their efforts were heroic, but ultimately insufficient. At 2:40 in the afternoon, a second wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the task force. This time, it was 10 Kate torpedo bombers from the Hiryu, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga, his aircraft damaged in the earlier mission and leaking fuel, knew this would be a one-way mission for him and several of his pilots. The torpedo attack was executed with textbook precision, despite fierce resistance from American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The Yorktown, already slowed by bomb damage, could not maneuver effectively to avoid the deadly torpedoes racing toward her port side. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier below the waterline, causing massive flooding and a severe list that eventually forced Captain Buckmaster to order his crew to abandon ship. As the afternoon sun beat down on the smoke-stained Pacific, both sides had bloodied each other severely. 3 Japanese carriers lay burning or sunk, while the Yorktown appeared to be following them to the bottom. Yet the battle's final act was yet to be played out, and it would fall to the one remaining Japanese carrier to determine whether the morning's catastrophe could somehow be transformed into strategic victory. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on June 4, 1942, the aircraft carrier Hiryu remained the last fighting unit of what had been the most powerful naval striking force in Japanese history. Captain Tomeo Kaku, his ship now operating alone after the destruction of her 3 sister carriers, faced a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the outcome of the entire Pacific War. At 4:30 in the afternoon, American scout planes from the Enterprise located the Hiryu approximately 100 miles northwest of the main battle area. The Japanese carrier was steaming at full speed, her flight deck spotted with aircraft as her crew prepared for what everyone understood would be a final, desperate strike. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American task force after the apparent loss of the Yorktown, wasted no time in launching a decisive attack. 24. Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, climbed into the afternoon sky with orders to finish what had been started. That morning, they were joined by 16 more dive bombers from the supposedly sinking Yorktown, which had managed to get her flight deck operational long enough to launch one final strike. The combined force of 40 aircraft represented everything the Americans could muster for this climactic attack. The Hiryu fought back with desperate fury. Her combat air patrol, reinforced by every available fighter, rose to meet the incoming attackers while the ship's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly explosions. Captain Kaku ordered his helmsman to make the Hiryu dance across the ocean's surface, turning and twisting in violent evasive maneuvers that threw his crew against bulkheads but might save his ship from the fate that had befallen her sisters. According to post-war interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers, archived at the Japanese Defense Agency, the final attack on the Hiryu was remembered as displaying the highest traditions of naval warfare from both sides, with professional respect maintained even in the heat of mortal combat. At 5:10 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Gallagher's dive bombers appeared overhead like birds of prey. The American pilots had learned from the morning's experience, coordinating their attack to overwhelm the Hiryu's defenses through sheer concentration of force. Gallagher himself led the 1st Division into their attack dive, his dauntless bomber screaming down through a maze of anti-aircraft fire toward the frantically maneuvering Japanese carrier. The first bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among parked aircraft. The explosion sent a geyser of flame and debris hundreds of feet into the air, but the carrier continued to fight. A second bomb struck amidships, starting fires that spread rapidly through the ship's wooden deck planking and aircraft fuel systems. The third and fatal blow came from the Yorktown's dive bombers, arriving just as the Hiryu's damage control parties thought they might contain the spreading fires. Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson, leading the attack despite flying from a supposedly doomed carrier, placed his bomb directly on the Hiryu's engine room uptakes. The explosion severed critical steam lines and gradually reduced the Japanese carrier's speed to a crawl. As evening approached, the Hiryu lay dead in the water, her flight deck a twisted ruin, and her hull glowing red with internal fires. Captain Kaku, standing on his bridge surrounded by smoke and destruction, made the painful decision that honor demanded. Rather than allow his ship to be captured or scuttled by enemy action, he would destroy the Hiryu himself with torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. At 2:10 in the morning of June 5, 1942, the last act of the Battle of Midway played out in darkness. Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes into the burning hull of their own aircraft carrier, sending the Hiryu to join her three sisters on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. With her went the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy and any realistic hope of achieving decisive victory in the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would reverberate across the Pacific for the remaining 3 years of the war. In 4 days of fighting, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, and more than 200 aircraft, along with many of their most experienced pilots. The United States had lost 1 carrier, a destroyer, and 150 aircraft, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. Never again would Japan possess the naval strength to mount major offensive operations, and the long road to Tokyo had begun with the thunder of dive bombers over the blue waters near a tiny coral atoll called Midway.